So, Cloud Cuckoo Land is a book that I do think, and not just because it won the Pulitzer Prize last year, it was published in 2021, I do think is a future classic. I think it's a monumental achievement, which doesn't mean you have to like it or admire it, but there you go. Would anyone like to take, we have over an hour, 5 or 10 minutes, and summarize the plot? So I'd like to say a few things about it, having done it now in 2 book groups. The response of the book groups that I've done it with has been decidedly bimodal, separated out without much middle ground. Most people really enjoyed it. Some people carped about it being too gimmicky, too hard to read, and especially thinking Anthony Doerr was making it gimmicky so it would sell, so it would be the kind of book you publish in 2021. Same-sex relations, eco-terrorism, sci-fi, a kind of melange. Now, I don't know Anthony Doerr. This is the 3rd book that I've read, and I've liked all of them, especially his collection of short stories called The Shell Collector, which I recommend to you. All the Light We Cannot See was a rave hit, commercially and critically. I think overrated, which doesn't mean I don't think it's a very good book. It's just not a very, 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 very good book, but there you go. I am certain that he didn't write the book to try to fit the tenor of the times. I think those people were mistaken, but that was their opinion. I will say that it's a wacky book. And one of the facts of fiction, one of the facts of all representation of human life, is there's a constant tension between realism and cartoonishness or caricature or hyperrealism. When cartoon animation was first created, one of the things that Walt Disney and Company, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs was the first full-length cartoon feature, is they worked very hard to make the cartoons, now they were comic characters, the 7 Dwarfs, but to make it absolutely realistic. That if a horse was walking, the horse had a shadow. And if you see things now like Toy Story or Frozen, it scares you to think that that's animation because it is so photographically, cinematically accurate, because that's the highest art for some people of animation. Look, they can make cartoons, animation, that looks just like the movies, looks just like people. But always at the other extreme is, well, we have cartoons. We can make Bugs Bunny's eyes go boing. We can make the Roadrunner run out over a cliff and hang in midair, and until he realizes he doesn't fall. Wile E. Coyote can blow up from dynamite, where the Ajax Company, and then reconstruct again. Because that's the fun of art. You can make believe. And that tension is fiction, is cinema, is cartoonishness, a matter of representing reality, and making characters like Anna Karenina, Hester Prynne, Holden Caulfield, Huckleberry Finn be like real people? Or is the joy of writing a novel to make things up that defy credulity, that have the feel of history? A number of things in this novel are issues that we deal with today. There's a lot of history in the book, but it is a wacky book. That's, I know, a very sophisticated literary term. I have a PhD, you'll excuse me. When some of the people said they thought it didn't do what novels should do, which is to be realistic, I pointed out that many people think the first novel in Western civilization, early 17th century, 1600s, was Cervantes' Don Quixote, which is a wacky book. Lots of imaginary things, a man who is besotted by books and a little demented and imagines that windmills are dragons and so on, and there's a lot of unreality and impossible coincidences, because that's what Cervantes wanted to do in his celebration of the romance of books, that books can tell the truth and they can also tell more than the truth. What's the last line of this novel, where Constance is reading the book? And the tale I have to tell is so ludicrous so incredible that you'll never believe a word of it, and yet she taps the end of his nose. It's true. Last word of the book is, it's true. My question is, with that as an intro, that the book is true and has lots of very serious points about reality and life, and has characters who I think we can recognize as competing with actual human beings, it's also wacky. How do you feel about that? That's a question you can't get wrong. How do you feel about it? It's an open question, it's a good question. How did you feel about the book and that combination of what I'm describing as seriousness? It's a celebration of books, it's a celebration of librarians, it's a celebration of the persistence of the written word, of tale telling. One of the things that's great about civilization is we lose a lot, but we keep a lot. And it's also has a kind of comic, supernatural, mythical drive to it as well. What do you think? Loretta said on tape that this is the book we would be discussing tonight. Yes. Just loud enough for the other side of the room. Thanks.
I think it was quite wonderful and always revealing, I had to be so focused to connect the threads. And there was
This is hard work, these book groups. Yes.
And I was amazed at how I know he did a lot of charts and worked very hard at, so his wasn't just, to me, trying to make something timely, or he did a lot of work to put that together, and it was full of surprises, and beautiful moments, and very visual. I thought
Very
it was
cinematic,
wonderful.
yes. You know, any author with a recognizable name sells the movie rights to the books before we even hear of it. Not a lot of them get made, but some of them do get made. I agree with you. He not only has to figure out how to do it, he has to figure out how to make it readable. I mean, it is a blessing that when you're in the Zeno chapter, it's Zeno. And when you're in the Seymour chapter, it's Seymour. Thank God for that. And he also tells you when the time frame shifts. Yes, this is good. Yeah, thank you. Other comments about how you found it? Yeah.
I found all the characters very sympathetic. There wasn't one that I didn't enjoy turning that page and starting that section.
Yeah.
There was a lot of jumping around back and forth, but that part didn't bother me. Now, I will say I've had no classical education. Never.
Until now.
Never got near Greek. Never got, well, I did have a little Latin in high school, but not much. And I thought, well, now, what would I be getting out of this if I had more background in my own education? Would it have made it that much better for me?
Well, it's hard to know. I will say that if you're sensitive to the fact that one of the great things that literary fiction does, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm not being snobbish when I say literary fiction. I mean fiction that has characters who we're supposed to accept as human beings. They have motivations, they have a credible psychological makeup, they seem real. As compared to genre fiction, romance, spy novels, Western, detective stories, books that I like, but no one is going to say these characters in those books have a kind of reality that these characters have. You're noticing empathetically that the characters are not just believable, but someone you can connect to. That experience probably served you better than a classical education. And I'm not trying to be patronizing. I think that's a good thing. One of the things that literary fiction does is it encourages you to feel close to people who don't exist. Because who wants to be close to the people? No, never mind. That's not where I meant to go with it. But it is true that you can only know a limited number of people who exist well, right? Your orbit, no matter how popular, no matter how big your family is, it's limited. And many of those people, you don't know from the inside out. You don't know what they're really thinking. What fiction can do is it can create people from the inside out. And you can know people in this book who strike you as more real than people you know. And that's just the way that art works. It's one of the glories of art. Thank you. Other comments about how you found it? Yes, thanks.
I just wanted to say that.
Just a little louder for them.
I felt like this was the most wonderfully unusual book I think that I've read in a really long time, and I felt like it really piqued my imagination took place in the future?
Constance.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Who is the constant character in the book?
Right.
Constantinople, Constantine, Constance. She persists, she figures a way out.
Yeah.
A number of characters in the book are incarcerated. She's one of them, and she figures a way out. She's the one who connects to the library. She's the hero of the book. And what does she end the book doing? She ends the book reading to her son. This should be a library spectacular, this book. Yes. Please, go ahead, say more if you want.
Well, I don't know much about Greek mythology, and I never really liked mythology, but this book also led me to look it up.
Yeah.
To figure out, that I felt like that was the thread throughout the novel.
Yeah, so let me give you a 2-minute primer on Greek mythology. I'm not being arrogant. Greek mythology does two things. One is it celebrates the infinite creativity of the human imagination. Who can make this stuff up, these stories?
Yeah.
It does that, and remember, the Greeks preceded the Romans, and the Romans, by and large, copied the Greeks and just changed the name. I'm not running them down, but they acknowledge that the Greeks were the superior society. We in America have a lot of places named after Roman places, and George Washington was called the American Cincinnatus because in the early 18th century, Americans didn't have access to Greek literature. It wasn't yet discovered yet. They had the Roman version, which is why James Joyce's novel is not called Odysseus, it's called Ulysses, because Irish school children didn't read the Greek, they read the Latin. Also the Roman Catholic Church had something to do with that. So one thing Greek literature does is it celebrates the infinite fecundity of the human imagination. And what better way to do it than say, look at how wacky these stories are, look at how impossible. 10 years to get to Troy, 10 years at Troy, 10 years back, son of a gun, his wife remembers him. You know, that kind of thing. That's why the Greeks couldn't imagine that human beings could do it on their own power. There must be goddesses, muses who inspired them. And the other thing that Greek literature does, and this is important, is it tries to show that the gods are petulant and petty and have all the emotions that human beings have, amplified by the fact that they're powerful. So when they pout, people die. And at the other end of the spectrum, not the transcendental, but what one 19th century writer called the descendental, it's all the stuff below human nature that is terrible. Demons and monsters. And how do the Greeks make monsters? They don't create a new monster. They take the head of this and the belly of this and the tail of this. They make monstrosities. Monster originally meant, in French and Latin, something horrific to look at. It's related to montrer, to show. And it was first used about farm animals that were born with two heads or were somehow freakish. And of course, to primitive people, that was a sign of displeasure. Something's wrong if your lamb is disfigured. And the monster of an animal became extended to a monster of a human being, to a monster who is monstrous in his or her character rather than their appearance. Greek literature tries to show what's wrong with the gods in their supernatural, powerful pettiness, and what's wrong with the subterranean world of freakishness and demonism, and tries to say that human beings occupy the middle place. They can be petty, but they can be magnanimous. They can have the inventiveness of the gods. They can have the charity and generosity of a god, but they are also capable of doing horrific things. Make your own list. Horrific things. And what Greek mythology, Greek drama tries to do is show you how hard it is for human beings to keep the middle ground. To keep the middle ground. To be humane with a supernatural dimension without getting too big for their britches. To recognize the demonic impulse of wanting to kill somebody, cook them and eat your own children. I mean, you know Greek literature, it happened. And to say, recognize that and be frightened by it, because people can do that. It doesn't take demonic possession to make somebody do evil things. And what Greek literature does is try to say, toe the middle ground. That's Greek literature in 2 minutes. Now, other comments about this book? Which has its own myth in it, yes?
I listened to it on discs and read it at the same time.
Was it read by one person on disc or multiple people?
There were multiple voices.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it helped me to focus on it. I felt just reading it was, I kind of lose my focus a little, and listening was the same. But I don't very often do that, but it was, I found it good. I enjoyed doing it that
Yeah,
way.
there are people who, I've listened to books on tape, especially back in the day when I had to commute 2 hours from Connecticut to SUNY Albany. One great advantage is the actor, sometimes the author, sometimes a cast of actors, is directing it for you. You know, when it says he told her, you don't know how loud he's telling her, or sometimes a single actor can change the register and all of a sudden you know it's a female, and you know it's always that person, where sometimes in a book, if two people are having an argument and you get lost, you have to go, wait a minute, him, her, him, her, right? But an actor, a company can do that for
The
you.
donkey was wonderful.
I agree that I think that's a great way to experience a book. And the libraries have books on tape, so you're not even cheating. Yes, thanks.
I have a question. Why do you think he made the boy that goes off with his,
Seymour?
yeah,
Yeah?
why do you think he gave him cleft
A little
palate?
louder, please.
Why do you think that boy had the cleft palate, which would be,
Oh, no, not Seymour.
oh, Omer.
What were you all saying to her? Would you say what you were saying to her so I can hear it?
It wasn't Seymour.
Just tell me what you said to her so I know what you were saying. Anybody?
I think they were just correcting her on
It
the
wasn't
character.
Well, tell me the correction. I just,
That it's
Omer.
Omer instead
Omer.
of Seymour.
Okay. Okay, so why does Omer have a cleft palate?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Okay, so I have said this before and I'll say it again. I don't think that's the right question to ask, respectfully. Rather than ask, why did the author make that guy have a cleft palate? That guy has a cleft palate. Like it or not, there it is. What do you do with that? That's a question you can answer. You can answer the question. You may not be right, but you can answer the question, what do you make of the fact that he has a cleft palate? And I'm going to ask you to do that in a moment. Whereas the question, why did Anthony Doerr do it, has no acceptable answer. And if someone says, oh, I read an interview with him and he said this is why he did it, that's not in the novel, that doesn't count. Anthony Doerr may be mistaken, he may be lying, he may be forgetful. Someday he'll be dead, God rest his soul, and we won't have him to kick around anymore. The novel will still be here. You as readers get to decide what something means. You may be wrong, but if enough of you believe it, that's what matters. If enough people says that bad, the word bad is good, the way young people did at one point, then it is. Try to stop it, you can't. Language is consensual, and so is literature. So, what's a possibility in your interpretation for why that character has a cleft palate? Yeah, please. You're going like this, but you raised your hand and no one else did.
Okay, no.
And did I mention there's a pre-copy of Catcher in the Rye?
Everybody's damaged in some way.
Yeah.
And everybody overcomes their damage in one way or another, which was one of the great parts for me
Yeah.
in the novel.
And he's damaged. I mean, Oedipus is referenced in this book, and Aristophanes and Ovid, and he's damaged in his communication organ, in a book that's celebrating communication, that ends with a book not being read by a little boy, but being read to, the little boy being read to. That is, the mother is telling the story. So you could make a connection between his deformity in his speaking part, right? Cleft palate actually affects the way you talk in a novel that's celebrating both the written tradition and the oral tradition. I mean, think of how much our lives have been shaped by people reading to us and by our reading. I mean, you're here tonight to talk about a book. You read the book, now we're talking about the book. Or you should have read the book, and now we're talking about the book. But I think that's one possibility. Now, that may not be right, but that's probably as good an answer as Anthony Doerr could come up with if he cared to tell us. And I'm quite serious about that. A good question to ask is, so here's an example. I can look through the glass of this window, especially if these lights were off, and I can see the building on the other side of the driveway. But if I concentrate, I can make the lenses of my eye adjust, and I can see the dirt, if there were dirt on the windows, and there isn't. I could see the dirt on the windows, but I couldn't see the building at the same time, right? So you can look through the window to see what it's showing you, or you can look out the window that's showing you. I can forget that this is a book and talk about Omir as a person, as if he were a neighbor. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and that's what most people in reading groups do, and that's what students first learn to do when they're younger. But they know they don't get credit for papers and college courses if you just talk about Omir as a sweetheart. So you have to find literary things to talk about, like his name sounds like Emir, a prince, that he has a cleft palate, and maybe that deformity doesn't stop him from being a normative character and so on. You can also talk about the means of seeing that thing on the other side. And literature allows you to do both. Why is it that in Star Trek, I have a very complicated cultural background, the captain always brings 2 or 3 non-regulars down to be killed in the first few seconds, right? Because there has to be some threat, and it can't be Spock or Bones, it has to be, and you know, in fact, you expect the guys to say, Captain, please, can you, I'm not a regular, I'm gonna, that has nothing to do with the realism of the story, that has to do with a convention, and if you know the convention, you know it. The Honeymooners always has a plot that Norton and Ralph cook up, it blows up in their faces, it goes wrong, their wives forgive them. It's the same thing every time. If you hate the show, you hate that it's the same thing. If you love the show, it's great. And when someone says, that's the plot of all of them. No, this is the one about the dog food. No, this is the one about the mother-in-law. The nature of art is, it is both real and it is artificial. It has constructs. And if the constructs are too obvious, you don't like the book because it seems corny. If the realism is too overwhelming, it reads like a documentary and there's no style. Some books are too true to be good. Too true to be good. They're so realistic, you're looking for something. Part of what this book has is style, a kind of panache. Think about those of you who grew up reading Greek or Norse or Roman mythology. When you're a kid, you read it because, look at Marvel Comics. They got Thor, they took Odin, they took these characters. You read them because they're fun and they're edgy and they're spirited and they're not just true things, they're impossible things presented as if they're really happening. How much fun is that? You were going to say something before, I think, and I've been keeping you waiting.
Oh, it's long gone.
Have you forgotten it? Have you forgotten it? That's what I was counting on.
I think you said it.
If it comes up again, just interrupt me, okay? Do this and interrupt me. Yes?
If I start by saying this, you slap my wrist, but I haven't finished it. But.
Quite all right.
You
can leave now.
What I'm crazy about is that the language makes me swoon.
Makes you?
Makes me swoon.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of literary fiction that's not showing off when it's doing that, and this is not. What's happening to me with this language is that ordinary things are illuminated with his use of language without a lot of what feels like show-off.
Yeah.
Just ordinary things blossom on
Yeah.
the page.
That's a good way of putting it. What some very talented writers do in my language, leading book groups for over 30 years, is that it feels more like, not this book, a performance than a novel. There are some very talented writers, and you read their prose, and it's beautiful, but it seems self-conscious and artificial. It seems like a performance. To read it and to be captured by it, to flow with it, and then maybe to stop and say, that was incredible, or maybe you mark it. Ian McEwan, I think, is that kind of writer. There are many, many others. The woman who wrote Hamlet, Maggie O'Farrell, who just came out with a new novel. You say to yourself, what extraordinary language that is keeping me entranced, even though I know it's only marks on a page. I mean, think of how much emotional energy we have spent in our lives on characters who don't exist. Tessa the D'Urbervilles was the first character in a novel that I, not yet an English major, actually fell in love with as a human being I felt sorry for. And I was a good reader, I was a pretty smart kid, but I never actually got connected to anybody until I read Tessa the D'Urbervilles. And she broke my heart because I thought she got a really raw deal, and she was, as the novel says, a pure woman faithfully presented. And I was struck, before I became an English major, by how someone could make up somebody that I would care that much about. The list has gotten a lot longer now, but there you go. Yeah,
Well, just that somebody I cared a lot about.
just a little louder.
Yeah, somebody I cared a lot about was Anna, and she wasn't physically damaged, but her boss in the embroidery shop called her hopeless.
Yeah.
And yet she was anything but hopeless.
Yeah.
And that a girl should not be tutored. Should
Yeah.
not go to school, essentially.
Yeah.
And she
And
overcame all of this.
you remember that weird name with the Q-A-A-N-A-A-Q?
Yeah.
That's a palindrome. Backwards and forwards, like radar or mom or noon or Anna. Anna is a name like Otto that's a palindrome. And that Argos is a trip that goes nowhere, like a palindrome. A palindrome ends where it started. Madam, I'm Adam. Backwards is Madam, I'm Adam. These are not original to me. That's famous. So you have this motif of everywhere you go, there you are. And for all the futurism, Constance winds up figuring out a way to get out of a spaceship that's not a spaceship from a prison, and she winds up where she started, but farther along because she has the book, she has knowledge. And isn't that what life is? If you were to plot out the calendar, we're coming up on Election Day, we're coming up on the clock changing, we're coming up on Thanksgiving. We've had, depending on your age and good fortune, 50, 60, 80 such days, but it's a year later, so it's a repetition with a change. It's exactly the same as last time, except we're a year older. That's so much of life. And that notion of her name being a palindrome, the code being a palindrome, the image of the book being a return to where they've always been, even the notion of preserving the book so the story can be passed on, the tradition continues, is a celebration of continuity. You want to say more?
I want to ask you a question. Is that legit?
Say again?
Is it legit to ask you a question?
Yes,
Because
I don't
it
have
has
to
do
answer it,
with
but you can
dates.
ask away.
Numbers-
Just a little louder for me.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. My hearing, not your fault.
Okay, well, maybe both. Numbers seem to be important in the work. And one number that struck me and that I don't understand it, but it's got to be significant in some way, is the final date and time in the novel is 2/20/2020, and the time is 7:02. And I'm wondering what all those twos have to do.
I have no idea.
I don't either.
But what I want to say is, I tell my students all the time, you cannot figure out if something means something until you pay attention to it. Now, when you pay attention to it, you may not get anywhere. You may just say, Zeno's 86 years old, right?
Yeah.
And 86 is the number of survivors. Do you remember that? 86 is the number of people who survived. Now, That's an odd coincidence when it's not determined by an actual head count. And you say to yourself, does that mean something? Well, maybe it does. And if you say to me, well, you noticed it, Schenker, but what good does that do us? You don't make any sense of it. I didn't notice it, said Billy, and I'm not any worse off than you. Yeah, but I was paying attention. And sometimes paying attention means you notice that Constance is a name about persistence and faithfulness, and she's the last character in the book, and her constancy is related to a book that hasn't disappeared. That's got to count for something. And maybe Anna's having a palindromic name matters, and maybe Omir sounding like Amir, an Arabic name for prince, where we get the word admiral from. It's not about admire, it's a version of the Arabic Amir, because the early Arabs were masters of the sea, and so on. So I do want to encourage you, if you want to be better readers, the first and foremost thing to do is just to pay attention. It's very easy, especially if books are bland or have patches of, like War and Peace. You read the peace parts because that's where all the human interaction, and then you're like, war. Oh, peace again. My students kid about Moby Dick, that they ignore all the stuff about the whale till they get to quotation marks because it's somebody talking. And they read Moby Dick and complain, so got a lot about a whale. Yes, it does, that's right. So pay attention if you want to be a better reader, but if you want to be better than that, pause over things like, why is it 7:02? Or why is this? 86 in diner language, I have a complicated past, means that you're out of something. You may have known that. 86 on the English muffins means we don't have English muffins anymore. Why 86, I don't know. But whether that has any connection to this, I don't know. But it's fun to guess. There's a terrific poem by W.H. Auden called Archaeology. If you typed it on a page, it would be about 2 inches wide and longer than any page. That is, it would look like an archaeological dig, like a well. And it's a celebration of the fact that archaeologists like that theirs is not a science but an art. When they find that a coin series that existed at this level no longer existed at a later level, that prince, that king is no longer on coins. Was he assassinated? Was the country overrun by other people? And they don't know, and one of the lines in the poem is, guessing is more fun than knowing. And I used to teach that to my students, to tell them, knowing's good, especially in the STEM field, and if you're working with plutonium, you should know something. But if you're a humanist, if you're working in liberal arts, guessing is a lot of fun. And part of the great thing about literature is to guess about things rather than to say, oh, I know that the author said this is why she did it, or whatever it might be. Myth is the first great celebration of realism and super-realism, hyper-realism at the same time, trying to have a dimension of moral instruction without sounding pedantic. The idea of blowing hot and cold? You've heard that? Oh, she blows hot and cold. So it comes from a myth of creatures that were thinking that they could conquer human beings, mortals, and found an old man who was outside and was very cold, getting wood for the fire, and in being so cold, he blew on his hands to warm them. And they were impressed by this because these visitors, supernatural, don't get cold. And they saw him go into his home, and they watched him, whether through the wall or telepathically or through a window, and he poured himself some soup that was too hot. You see where this is going? And he blew on the soup to make it cold. And they were freaked out because this creature can blow hot and cold. That's where the expression comes from. Now, some guy, named Achilles, some guy named Zeno somewhere, said that'd make a good story, and he made up that story. The story of the Trojan Horse. Somebody came up with that. What a great story. Make a horse, put a lot of people in it, give it to them as a gift, they take it in, they're dead. And all the other things you think of. Oh, Midas is so outrageously prideful, he asked that everything he touched turn to gold because he wants money, and he finds out first he can't eat. Because even if he doesn't touch the apple, once it touches his teeth, it turns to gold. And worse, he can't touch his daughter because he makes that mistake and she turns to gold. It turns out that what he asked for, the gods knew he shouldn't have asked for. It's the booga booga of Greek mythology. Tithonus, a young Greek, is in love with the goddess of the dawn, Eos, E-O-S. Every time she comes, he loves her, but she has to leave because she's the goddess of the dawn. She only hang out for a little bit. And he says to her, I'm getting older, I'll die. Can you ask your friends, the gods, to let me live forever? And she says, you know, we shouldn't muck around with these things. But she loves him, he loves her. So she asked the gods, and Zeus said, knowing that it's going to be bad, all right, if you're sure that's what you want. You know, there are like 90 Twilight Zones based on this whole notion of getting what you want and then paying for it. Twilight Zone, Honeymooners, Star Trek, you see the motif here. Well, it turns out that he asked for everlasting life, but his lawyer forgot to read the fine print. He forgot to ask for what? To stay young. So he ages infinitely. He is the only creature in the universe who will live forever but grow old. Human beings die after a while, which is a relief. The gods don't die, but they don't age. He's in that middle hell that he's aging forever. And how does he get older? Every time his girlfriend comes, it's another day. She's the goddess of the dawn. So when she visits him, which she has to do because that's her job, he gets a day older. So old by the end of the myth that he can't lift his head off of the pallet that he's lying on. And Tennyson, the great Victorian poet, wrote a magnificent poem called Tithonus about that hell because he was trying to articulate the grief he had over the death of his young friend who was set to marry his sister, in memoriam, where we get the line, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." He used that notion of always getting older but not having the release of it ending to talk about bereavement. It's magnificent. And some Greek thinker came up with that story. I think that this book, whether or not you're conversant in Greek mythology, but if you're sensitive to the fact of what myth-making does, you got it? Did you?
I got it.
I told you to interrupt me, come on.
It was back to Greek mythology. He has done so much work that he can give you everything you need in there. And when they carry this icon through the streets of Constantinople to a certain place, that place is not there anymore now.
Right.
But he had to go, I don't know what, just finding all these concrete details. So, and gives you enough that you don't have to look up anything. You might for fun.
Yeah, thank you for that contribution. If you were to read the last pages of Zeno's Sacrifice, where earlier, near the end of the book, the kid has the gun at his head and he picks up the phone and starts to ring, and then there are some intervening chapters. He knows how to plot a novel. And then you're back with Zeno grabbing it and making the run, and the last word is ring without the G. Read that out loud to someone who hasn't read the book, if they don't mind the spoiler. Or if you know someone who's read the book, read that page and a half out loud. It's as good as any spy, crime, suspense, mystery novel. It takes your breath away about how that's constructed. And if you've read the 2,047 pages that preceded, everything that comes before, you have a real appreciation for the humanity of this man, of this extraordinary man. What's the name of the character who is back with the original manuscript, who's telling the actual mythical story?
Diogenes?
I'm sorry, the character in it. Diogenes, right. Diogenes is the man who wrote Cloud Cuckoo Land, and his name means God born. Dios is God, Genes is making or born, like Genesis, genetic. But the character in it is Aethon, A-E-T-H-O-N, which is a version of the Greek word for burning or glowing or blazing. That character has a name that begins with A, and Zeno with Z. And the story begins with this character, I don't mean the first line, but this character making this wacky journey and deciding not to stay in Cloud Cuckoo Land, because if you live in paradise, you don't have any motivation. And what's the name of the realty company that's taking over the forest? What's the name? Pay attention. Eden. Remember? Eden.
Oh.
It's hardly a paradise, but Eden in a novel that has a paradise in the Greek context that is rejected. And the ship that's going to go somewhere in the future that's not going is looking for a paradise. In that context, a cleft palate may be a blessing, right? That I have an imperfection which keeps me human, like getting older and not living forever while aging, eventually dying, being mortal, yeah. I know I'm talking very broadly, but it's an impossible novel, even with a group of people who've read it, I'm only kidding, to actually talk about in terms of, then this happens, there's too much of this. But I do think it's an extraordinary accomplishment to write such a rich and complicated novel. And I agree, I think he must have had Post-its or index cards all over the place, or maybe he works on a computer only, and is so readable. Yes?
How, for me,
Louder for that. Don't just talk to me, talk to them.
I don't know what makes a future classic. I know, for me, what makes a novel compelling. But for me, I stepped into this novel, it opened the door and I stepped into it and I was riveted. Was there a criteria or a set of criteria that you used that made you say, not just this is a wonderful book and I want to talk about it, but it is a future classic? What were those criteria?
I try to make Loretta happy. You think I'm kidding? I'm not laughing. By coming up with a marketing hook for these books. She knows.
I don't know what you're talking about.
If I told you that I picked Sing Unburied Sing and Cloud Cuckoo Land because each of them has a 3-word title, you'd laugh at me. So instead, I'm telling you, I picked 2 books that I think will have some longevity. And as I've said, it's now, 8 years or more that I've been doing future classics. As I say each time, if 40 years from now I'm wrong, come talk to me about it. I don't have a set of criteria. I will say that I've read a lot of books, not as many people, but a lot of books. I think I'm a good reader and I have an attention for what you might call literary value. I'm not broadly read in that there are genres and people I've never read, and because of the nature of my book groups, I sometimes read multiple books by a single author instead of more broadly. But I think I know some books that will be masterpieces, and that's a harder and harder thing to predict when there are so many books and so many platforms. But I have nothing invested in it, and not only because you won't find me in 40 years, because I'll be hiding. Don't get ahead of yourself. But I have often, when I've taught a book here, been gratified that some of the people respond with the same sense of, this is a really special book, this is a book that really engaged me. And when you think about how easy it is to read a book, enjoy it, and forget it, with my undergraduates, and it's not because I'm talking down to them, but I tell them that if they think of a book like a meal, there are some books when you're reading, they're not very enjoyable as a dining experience. But in fact, as you read it, you get used to those spices. And you say, you know what, I didn't think I liked Armenian food. food, but it's actually kind of growing on me. And then you value the experience partly because you didn't like it at first and now you did. And the meal becomes memorable because of that transformation. People have had those meals, maybe you have a relative who's cooked such a meal and it's grown on you, or maybe it's taken 2 or 3 meals to grow on you. Then there are meals that you just love when you're eating them because they're delicious, but they're not particularly nutritious, and you forget about it immediately. There are a lot of books that are a pleasure to feast on, and then you forget them. And then there are books in the middle ground, very few, that are enjoyable while you're eating them, and give you some kind of sustenance and stay with you and become memorable. Sometimes they're memorable because of where you are in your life, or if you're fortunate enough to have a partner, whether a living partner or another person reading the book with you, or you're in a book group, not this book group maybe, but a book group of your own devising, or you're taking a community college class and you have a group of people who experience reading this together. Maybe someone tonight said something you didn't think of, but you would have if you thought of it. That is, they spoke something you would have said too, but you didn't think to say it. And that experience of having someone else say it, and you're hearing them outside you, will make you remember that. Yes, thanks for waiting. Loud enough for the people behind you. Yeah.
There's a sustenance. There is a pure heart in this book that I think is its sustenance. That for all the difficulties and troubles and brokenness and wars and collapsing and destruction and
Right,
danger.
war is another great theme of the book, yes.
Yeah. For all that's happening, there is a through line of faith and truth and hope and willingness to take the next step that goes all the way through it. And I think that's the sustenance of life. And it's just utterly dear to me that his mother is a librarian. Antonio
Right.
Moore's mother is a
Right.
librarian. And the image at the end of the woman reading to the child is just...
Right, and the idea that the generations, one of the people at the end of the book is a descendant from one of the girls that was saved.
Right.
And again, the idea of constance being an image of constancy, of persistence, of resistance. And she's not just constant in the sense that she's a survivor. She figured out how to get out of that thing. She made the connection virtually to the library. She's not just someone who endured, she's someone who triumphed. And that's what you want in life and in literature. Lots of people victims of war, lots of people victims of abuse, a number of people incarcerated, Constance, Zeno, Seymour, the tension between the Eden of the realty company and the idea of human hope for Eden. The book covers autism, single mom, same-sex relationships, climate change, eco-terrorism, survivalism, virtual reality, myth, fable, sci-fi, war, the siege of Constantinople, the Korean War, World War II, eco-terrorism.
Animal cruelty.
Sorry?
Animal cruelty.
Yes, and not in a trivial way. Again, I think some people who didn't like the book, which is their right, thought that, well, this is kind of boutique-y, like let's throw it. One woman said, I think not in a homophobic way, in the same argument that it's too gimmicky, why do they have to be homosexual? Well, ask the question the other way. They are homosexuals. And so now what do you do with that? Take that as a done A. And if you don't accept that, if you say, I think it's a stretch, I don't believe that they're homosexuals, then that's a failure of the novel, in your view. It's just not convincing. You know, some movie stars, I'm saying movie stars instead of actors, have so much charisma and personality, you can't forget that that's Cary Grant. He's a good actor, and he's beautiful. I mean, I would marry him, and I'm a zealot of heterosexuality, but there it is. So what did they do? Alfred Hitchcock put him in a movie where he's a suspected killer. Suspicion. And tried to have that stick, because he's mainly a romantic hero of light comedy. Sometimes things don't work out and it's just not believable. So if a sticking point for a reader of the novel is, it seems too trendy, autism, eco-terrorism, taking over the woods, that owl, it just seems too obvious. Well, that's your right. We all have different tolerances for what's realistic. But I've said before in this room, the only reason why truth is stranger than fiction is that fiction has to be believable and truth doesn't. And you think of all the things that have really happened that are absolutely unbelievable, and they happen. Yeah, it's funny because it's witty. It's not original to me. I've given this example, but I'll give it again. So you decide that you're going to pitch a story to a Hollywood producer about a state-of-the-art ocean liner that's going to go from Southampton, England, to New York City, crossing the North Atlantic, which is infamous for icebergs. But it's been designed to combat damage by iceberg because it has not 2, not 4, but 8 of these airtight structures. And as long as 3 of them are undamaged, it won't sink. And the person pitching this says, and then JC, the producer, on the first voyage out, hits an iceberg, 7 of the 8, and it goes down in a matter of minutes. This magnificent, let's call it Olympic, this ocean liner, goes down on the first voyage. And the producer says, you know what, let's make it the 3rd voyage. Because the first voyage is just, I know it's funny, but I'm being quite serious. It's just too impossible to believe. Yes, you wouldn't write it because it is too impossible, but the impossible happened. The World Trade Center being taken down by men with box cutters. What did they use as a bomb? The plane. They took lessons to take off, but not to land. If you wrote that 30 years ago, people would say, you're nuts. This is, is Schwarzenegger available? It just seems impossible, and it happened. And you can fill in as many things as you want. Wonderful things about heroism. Again, the Greek notion that human beings are capable of divine-like supernatural actions, and they're capable of doing wretched, wretched things. And there you have it. They're still human beings. That's the mystery that the Greeks were pondering. That's why they could write comedies and tragedies like Shakespeare at the same time. I do think the book has a kind of epic feel. I think it takes a kind of guts to make a mass marketed bestseller, you hope, called Cloud Cuckoo Land.
Yeah,
I
really.
remember when a friend of mine said, have you heard of the new Anthony Doerr book? I said, no, it's called Cloud Cuckoo Land. Now, I've read Aristophanes' play, so I had in the back of my mind, that's from somewhere, where's that from? But even when I knew where it was from, I thought, that's a gutsy move. Yeah, I'd like a copy of Cloud Cuckoo Land, please. For your grandson? Yes, he's just learning to read. Yeah.
I was going to say that with this, not accusation, but citing that he's writing tricky things to sell books, in an exchange, imagining the pressure that he was under after the book before, All the Light.
Yeah.
From publisher, from 2 kids going to college, his editor and everybody else. How did you overcome that? And the answer was, I just decided to write something that I liked.
Yeah, yeah. And you may know the writer Annie Proulx. And she said famously, I think it was, did she write the Shipping News?
Yeah.
So she said in an interview about the Shipping News that she had heard when she was a young writer and she wanted to be a writer, she constantly heard the classic advice, write about what you know, so that it will be convincing and relevant. Don't go beyond your knowledge. And she said she wanted to write about things she didn't know, and she would study things she didn't know to expand her knowledge base. And she wrote the Shipping News because she was studying nautical knots and things about boats that she knew nothing about. And I was always impressed by that notion that here's a writer, a very good writer, very successful, very talented, who decided to do something different from the things that most people do. Tolstoy is rumored to have said famously that he looked around the landscape and did not see anyone quite like the Anna Karenina he had in his head, and so he made her to fill that gap. Now, some writers can say, I'm writing to complete something that's missing from reality, and other writers say, my goal is to represent reality, like that Walt Disney notion, can I do a movie that competes with realism, like many of the great Walt Disney, Pixar, whatever, celebration. But there's always that other parody, that other celebration. Let's make a movie about things that people can't possibly do. Isn't that fun as well? And the idea of a terrorist bombing, the idea, God help us, of children in a public venue at risk from a madman, on and on. And again, I think that responsible writers can write about such sensational facts responsibly, and I think this is a very responsible book. I have not reread it, even though this is the third time I'm talking about it, because this is the nature of my life when school's in session. But I have read chunks of it, including just a couple of hours ago when I was sitting out in the lobby. It has real staying power. It's just a beautifully written book and a future classic.
You heard it here.
I wonder if we went around, if we'd all choose a different favorite character.
I'm sure there'd be lots of variances. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, my favorite was Seymour.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but I also thought the character of Constance's father was a wonderful character.
I agree.
He was just extraordinary. And I thought Seymour's mother was another, just pathetic bunny. Just struggling so hard, but loving her son, but just unable to prevent the catastrophe.
Yeah.
You just got so sucked into these dramas.
And partly it's because, so when Ulysses was first published in 1922, reviewers and teachers and literary critics were at a loss to describe who is the narrative voice of the book. Many, many chapters written in a different style, written in a different time of day on this particular day, June 16th, 1904. And there's no central narrator. Some of the stories are told first person, some are not. So they came up with the word arranger, from the musical idea of somebody who puts these pieces together, even though they didn't write the individual pieces. So there's nobody who's Joyce, there's no narrator. It's all these pieces put together like a kind of collage. And in fact, Donald Barthelme, the poet and short story writer, said famously, famous now that I tell you, that collage is the art form of the 20th century. Invented by Picasso and another artist. Guernica, lots of Picasso's creations. Ulysses, take the pieces apart, put them back together, make sense of it. When you write that kind of book, you don't privilege any one person, neither a narrative voice like Jane Austen's narrator, who never identifies, we'll say herself because it's written by a woman, but everybody who's read Jane Austen knows that that's a very companionable narrator, not a person. You know, she doesn't say, I was walking through Southampton the other day and met the way Dickens will sometime. We know what a Jane Austen narrator sounds like. We like to think it's Jane Austen. Very different from a Joseph Conrad narrator, and very different from a book like Moby Dick, which has its own narrator, Call Me Ishmael, or Holden Caulfield's Catcher in the Rye, or Nick Carraway's Great Gatsby. When you write from a particular person's point of view, you are going to see why certain people in the book are dislikable. It's impossible to like Tom Buchanan if you're reading the novel from Nick Carraway's point of view. It's impossible not to have some sympathy for Jay Gatsby because you're reading the novel from Nick Carraway's point of view. I don't mean you can't come to your own judgment, but while you're reading the book, you're limited in what you're seeing. But when you read a book like this, where no one's advantaged as a narrator, and everybody is presented outside and inside, it's easier to exercise your humanity. And the whole reason to read literary fiction, the whole reason that I travel all the way here from New Haven on a World Series night, I'll have you know, is that I actually believe that reading literary fiction makes us better people. And some 10 or 15 years ago, 2 social psychologists did a study that found that when you compare how people who are often readers of literary fiction with people who don't read literary fiction but read genre fiction, that is fiction that doesn't compete with reality, or don't read fiction at all, the people who read literary fiction gave answers on blind quizzes that were more sympathetic to other people. Because they had more experience knowing people you wouldn't know. I never met Seymour, and now I have. And if it's written in the context of someone who is not being judgmental, but trying to be literarily representative and credible, it's a version, an artistic version, that to know someone is to love them, to really get a sense of them. And because, I'll get you in a moment, thank you, and because there's nothing at stake, that is, you can like him without having to say to your husband, I know you want him to be put to death because you think he's a maniac, but he's just a guy in a book. You know, you read Othello, and Othello is a great example of a play where the hero, Othello, is kind of a schmo. It's a literary term, you could look it up. He is. He can't believe that this European white woman loves him, and he has so many doubts that Iago can play on his insecurities. And Iago is a mastermind of human nature and manipulation. Iago basically writes a play with props and a storyline, and Iago is the Shakespeare of Othello. He's a wretched person. But when you read the play, you realize, or you go to see it, anyone ever see Othello in performance? Whenever Iago is on the stage, the play is more interesting. And when Othello is on the stage, it's not as interesting. It's like God the Father in Paradise Lost. He's a snooze. Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost. Milton didn't know how good he was. And so when you read something like, I just lost my train of thought of which book I was talking about. What was I saying first before Paradise Lost? Othello, right.
Yeah.
You realize that you like Iago as an artistic experience, but you don't have to worry that he's going to move into your neighborhood or date your sister. Whereas if you met him at a cocktail party and you had exactly the same response, what a fascinating, wicked guy, you'd worry if he started dating your sister, because there's a practical dimension that gets in the way of how you feel. Art removes the practical dimension. Thanks for waiting.
Would you give us a working definition of literary fiction?
Give you a working definition? Yeah, I think I did, but I'll repeat it.
Would you please?
Yeah, it's a work of fiction where the characters are meant to be taken as actual human beings with histories and emotions and motivation. The guys who are the extras in Star Trek have no backstory. They're just props. That's not a literary creation. Captain Kirk has a personality over the course. So he's more of, if it were a book, a literary creation, and the other people are just props. You read novels where some characters actually matter, and some are just, well, we need a bad guy, he's a bad guy. And you don't puzzle about what made him bad, because they need a bad guy. Somebody has to get killed, let's get these two schmoes to come up and do it. Literary fiction is fiction that purports to present characters who compete with actual human beings. They have motivation. I'll give you an example. Examples are better than definitions. So you read King Lear, and King Lear decides very early, opening scene of the play, that he's too tired to be king, he wants to retire, and he wants to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters, and he'll give the best part of it to the daughter who loves him best. Now, if you're someone in Shakespeare's day, this is already trouble, because 1, Kings like popes don't retire until recently. And so just to retire is bad. To take a kingdom and break it in three is very bad. Shakespeare's people knew that there was terrible things that happened in England and other nations by separating powers. And to make a competition among your children to say who loves me best is even worse. So there's trouble in the beginning of the play, and his daughter Cordelia, who loves him best and he knows it, won't play the game. The first daughter, Reagan, says, I love you, Dad, I love you like crazy. Did I mention I love you? Very good. Here's the part of the kingdom you get. And you ask yourself, how could she have gotten her prize when the other two daughters haven't gone yet? Because the fix is in, Lear knows that Cordelia loves him best. It's rigged. She's going to get the best part. Goneril comes up and says, you think she loves you? I love you so much. I love you even more than my husband. I love you. Did I mention I love you? Okay, very good. You get this part. Cordelia, standing aside, says as an aside, you already know she's a sweetheart. She gets an aside. How can I compete with this? And she says, Father, I love you. I love you as much as I should, and I hope that's a good enough answer for you. And he says, did you miss rehearsal? What's happening here? These have said so much more, say more. And she says, what did my sister get married for if they love you more than their husband? And he says, have you nothing to add? And she says, most famous one-word line in Shakespeare, nothing. Have you nothing to add? Nothing. Which is the Elizabethan version of, because she's her father's daughter. He's stubborn, she's stubborn. You may know people like this. You may be one of them. You may be a parent who has that kind of children, or you may have a husband, an uncle, who is that with it, whatever. The father says, giving her another chance, nothing can come of nothing. Speak again. Now, it's not true that nothing can come of nothing. You can write a sonnet out of nothing. You can write a play out of nothing. You can write a big old future classic out of nothing. You can make babies out of nothing. I know the biology, but what I mean is you don't need stuff to do lots of things like love somebody. Shakespeare knows that. So when the father says nothing can come of nothing, people in the theater know that that's another mistake that he's made. Retiring from the kingship, breaking the empire, having his daughters compete, abusing Cordelia, who gives the loving answer, and he should be happy. Plus they know that the Bible says that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's the kind of thing you can do when you're a creator.